Here are a group of slide rules manufactured over the years by the Keuffel and Esser company, or I should say sold over the years, because I'm not sure that all of them were manufactured by Keuffel and Esser, which is often abbreviated K&E, but I think most of these, if not all, were actually manufactured by them. Here is a synopsis of the rules that we're going to talk about today, and they are arranged in order of the model number. But like every other slide rule manufacturer, the model numbers do not necessarily increase over the years. Instead, they sometimes jump around. So the first one we're going to look at is the 4071. It's a fairly simple duplex slide rule introduced in 1939. This one I have been able to confirm the dates and was still being sold in 1967. The next ones are the 4080 and the 4081, and the 4081 and the N4081 were the most popular duplex, log-log duplex rules, I think, of all time. I think, well, I know K&E sold a lot more rules than any of the other manufacturers, and I think the 4081 and its predecessor, the 4080 combined, they sold more log-log duplex slide rules out of that set than any other set, not only by K&E but by the other manufacturers. There is also a 4083 in this set, and I'm including that one, although I'm going to talk about it in a future video, because it is one of the early vector, and by vector what I mean is, or what they mean is, that it includes hyperbolic, tangent, sine scales. Then a 4092, which actually is, I think, the oldest rule among these. It goes back to 1936. It's a log-log duplex as well. And finally, the most recent one, the De-cilon 10, which is the one here at the bottom, that was sort of the model, the modern slide rule that K&E made, that sort of closed out the slide rule era. Here are three of the manuals that K&E supplied with the rules. The one on the left is the log-log duplex slide rule, the 4092. The one in the middle is the 4080, which is labeled log-log duplex trig. And the one on the right is the 4081 log-log duplex decitrig. Now the two on the right were the ones that I told you were the most popular slide rules that K&E made. And you may notice one difference. The one in the middle says trig, the one on the right says decitrig. Well, look at the difference. The difference is whether you measure trig functions, the sine and tangent and cosine scales, with minutes and seconds or with decimal degrees. So we will look at that, and we'll also look at how the log-log scales changed over the years from original log-log scales, some of which were referenced to the A and B scale and some to the D scale, to the later rules like the 4081, where the log-log rule or log-log scales were all referenced to the D scale. Finally, I'll show you the book that sort of closed out the K&E slide rule era, the De-cilon book. A very nicely printed and bound manual. And for a general slide rule book, I would recommend this one if you're going to be buying one like this. Now there's another slide rule book that, if you have little or no experience with slide rules, and I think I've mentioned this in a previous video, it's this one, Slide Rule and How to Use It. This was printed by Barnes & Noble, and I believe that all of these books, that is this one, the De-cilon, and these three K&E instruction manuals can all be found online at the International Slide Rule Museum. Here are a couple of cases that these slide rules came in. I'll close this one up for right now. The one at the top was for the De-cilon. The one at the bottom was for many of the others, like the 4081 and the 4080. So let's get on and look at some of these slide rules. The first rule we're going to look at is this 4092. So I'm going to zoom in a little so that you can see the scales a lot better, because that's where I think the interesting issues arise. This is one side of the 4092, and you may notice that it has K scale and L scale at the top and bottom, and then in the middle the folded scales, the inverted scales, and the C and D scales in sort of that order. To me, the more interesting side, though, is this side, which contains the log-log scales and the trig scales, as well as the A and B scale, and an extra C scale. Notice that the trig is in minutes and seconds, and you'll see that changes in the day. And remember, this very time-worn manual goes back to that period. Trig was taught with minutes and seconds. It was only later that it was taught with decimal degrees, and then also in more advanced courses with radians as the degree measure. But there are two things about this rule that changed over the years. The first is the fact that the trig is in minutes and seconds. The second is the log-log scale. This log-log scale is actually referenced to the A and B. Let me get a different pointer here so I won't be casting such a shadow. And because of that, the middle of this scale is actually the end of the scales on some of the other rules. In other words, the values from the middle to the right would make up one entire log-log scale, and the values from the middle to the left would make up the other. And of course, the reason for that is because the A and B scale is repeated on the left and on the right. So they could, in one 10-inch, or actually 25-centimeter rule, they could put log-log rulings covering a double range. Later, when they changed that, and we'll look at that, you'll see they had to add log-log scales. Now, those are really not new. What they had to do is they had to split this one in half, put one half at the top and the second half below it. But then they referenced not to the A and B scale, but to the C scale in this case, or the D scale in other cases. So two differences, log-log scales and trig measure. Now we're looking at the 4071. You may notice that the K scale does not appear at the top of this side of the rule. The L scale, though, has been retained, and there is a CIF and a CI scale. On the other side, you notice two things, or at least I want to point out two things. One is they've moved the K scale to this side, and they've put the DI scale at the bottom. That's the first thing. The second thing is the trig is now in decimals of degrees. You may remember that this used to be, I think it was 40 minutes or something like that, and 50 minutes. In other words, that was decimals of 1 degree, and 1 degree is over here a little bit. That's the ST scale. But now it's in tenths of degrees rather than in minutes and seconds. So the DI is introduced as a new scale, and as you saw on the other side, the CI and the CIF are introduced as additional inverted scales or inverse scales. And here we have the 4080. Notice the L scale has been moved to the top of the rule, and then a log-log scale, which now references the D scale. They have retained the CIF and the CI. They have a C and D on this side, and then two log-log scales at the bottom. The three scales together, 1, 2, and 3, cover the range of most log-log rules of the day. As we'll see when we get to some other slide rules, some manufacturers added a fourth scale and to improve the coverage, because log-logs are basically representations of natural logarithms, e to the x or e to the minus x. E to the minus x, of course, is exactly the same as 1 over e to the x. So generally, if the numbers were greater than 1, the exponent was greater than 1, you used scales that were printed in black. And that's true on this rule as well. Once they changed to using the D scale as the common reference, that pretty much stayed the same. Now notice on this side, they have two log-log zero scales, a 0 and a double 0. However, I point out these are referenced to the A and B scales. So they retained the DI, they've moved the K down here, and in addition to the AB, they have the standard trig. But notice that this one is back to minutes and seconds. Now that's because this is, once again, a little bit earlier rule than the one we just looked at. So what about these scales? Well, unfortunately on this rule, they did not mark these in red, but these are actually exponents that are less than 1. And because they are referenced to the A and B scale, you essentially get twice as much range per scale as you would on the later rules, or even on the other side of this rule. However, you give up some accuracy in doing that because the graduations are, of course, have to be closer together. So that is the 4080. And now we get to the 4081, which was, I think, the most popular log-log duplex rule that Keuffel and Esser sold. May have been the most popular log-log duplex rule ever. Notice that the log-log scales now, the 01 and the 1, are on the same side of the rule, and they are referenced to the D scale, and the ones for exponents less than 1 are printed in red, so you know that you're looking at exponents less than 1 as opposed to in black for exponents greater than 1. Once again, it has a K scale and an L scale, and in between the AB, the trig scales, and the D scale. Notice that the trig scales on this one are in decimals, so this would be called a decitrig rule. On the other side, you find more log-log scales, but the reason that they had to put more log-log scales on these rules is when you referenced it to D, each scale, while it became more accurate, was now spread out over a greater distance. And so, to get the range that you wanted, you had to have two additional log-log scales greater than 1 and two log-log scales less than 1 to cover the same range. In fact, it turns out that the rules that were referenced A and B in general actually covered a greater range than many of the later rules, but at much less accuracy. Well, at half the accuracy. So once again, for exponents less than 1, they're in red. For exponents greater than 1, they are in black. And then, of course, the standard folded C and D, the inverted folded C, the inverted C, and then the C and D scales. And now the 4083, which is a bit of a unique rule, as we'll see when we turn it over. But you notice at the top we have the L scale. Then you have the LL1, LL2, and LL3 scales. The folded C and D, the inverse folded C, the inverse C, and then the C and D scale. So let's turn the other side and see what's unique about this rule, or at least different from all the other rules that we have seen so far. On the other side, we start with the LL0 scales, and then once again you're back to the references are different, but notice that at the bottom there are 3 new scales, TH, SH2, and SH1. TH stands for hyperbolic tangent, and the next 2 are for hyperbolic sine. And there are 2 of them, one for 40 up to 45, and the other for 45 to in the high 80s. The S, ST, and T scales are once again in decitrig format. So this was called a vector log-log slide rule, and we're going to include this in a future video on vector slide rules, so I won't talk about it further here. And now we're on to the De-cilon. The De-cilon was pretty much the last, and a lot of people call it the kitchen sink, because they pretty much included everything. You notice that there are 4 log-log scales in red, in other words, for numbers less than 1, from log-log or ln0 to ln3. There are the A and B scales, the trig scales. It has a C and a D on the same side with the trig. That's a little unique. The DI scale and the K scale. On the other side, you see that you have square root scales that we will see again when we look at some of the, well, for example, those seem to be fairly popular. They were, I'm not sure who introduced them first in the United States, but they were popular on European rules. And these are the same as on the Versalog. The Versalog introduced these square root scales. I think they called them by a different name, but they're the same scales. Then the folded C and D, the folded C inverse, the L scale, unique because now it's on the slide, the inverted C, and then a C and D, so a full C and D on both sides. And then down at the bottom are the logs from 0, 1, 2, and 3. So 4 scales of log-log. So this was called the kitchen sink because except for the vector scales, that is hyperbolic functions, this rule had just about everything that previous rules had had. Of course, the trig is in decimal, and all of the log-log scales relate to the C and D now. So this is the set of rules that I wanted to show you. Now, obviously, K&E made a lot more rules, and one of these, the vector, we're going to see again. But for now, I hope that this has given you a little bit of a historical overview of the K&E slide rules over the years, how they developed, how they changed. The 2 biggest changes were going from minutes and seconds to decimal trig, and going from 2 different kinds of log-log scales, one reference to the AB, one reference to the CD, to a consistent set of what are called symmetric log-log scales, where they all are referenced to the D. And one reason that they're called symmetric is that while in this case it's a little inconvenient because these are on one side, that is the positive, the greater than 1 exponents, while the less than 1 exponents are all on the other side. And you will see in some other rules where it's convenient to have those all on the same side, because what it allows you to do is to read reciprocals between the red scales and the black scales. But I won't get into that. Instead, I would think I will end this video here and tell you that we will be doing some more. I promised we would do a vector, one on vector slide rules, as well as try to cover the rest of the manufacturers, at least of the limited number that I have some good examples of. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll look forward to some more videos, and in the meantime, have a nice day.